Aku angkat siapa yang internet. Adit, kamu bisa bantu saya nanti jadi ini apa co-host. Jadi kalau ada yang masuk saya lagi ngajar, tolong diterima ya. Daniel juga, Daniel posisi di mana, Neil? Siapa yang di rumah posisinya kenceng?
Saya bisa, Bu.
Siapa nih? Adit ya, udah ya, Adit bantuin ya,
Ya.
Adit ya. Oke, yuk kita mulai perkuliahan. Kalian sama sore ya? Masih pagi. Masih sepi banget. Kalau dingin terus. Oke, ini udah perkuliahan ke-11. Kalau yang kemarin anak pagi, saya kasih game dulu, tapi ini kayaknya nggak usah deh kita. Apa namanya, karena susah kalau tak kasih game nanti besok kalian gabung sama kelas C harus ngegas gitu ya. Kelas C itu kan double. Jadi langsung ke materi aja ya. Kalau yang kemarin anak pagi, Dit. Jadi per hari ini kita bicara tentang ini arsitektur Roma. Kemudian minggu depan kalian sudah mulai mensubmit presentasi kalian di sini. Jadi di sini tuh kalian nanti mensubmit presentasi kalian 3 menit untuk mulai meyakinkan satu proyek yang menjadi bagian dari arsitektur Romawi. Oke, sekarang materinya ya. Materinya ada di sini. Jadi ada hal yang menunjukkan sebuah ciri-ciri yang sangat berbeda dari arsitektur Romawi. Jadi kalau kemarin arsitektur Yunani itu kita belajar tentang bagaimana kemegahannya karena mereka sedang bagus-bagusnya memahami tentang mekanika bangunan sehingga mereka bisa menggunakan kekuatan sebuah mekanika. Nah, sekarang di sini itu sudah mulai ada unsur, kalau di sini di bahasa Indonesia kan itu dibuat seperti membuat terkesan. Yang dimaksud itu bahwa mulai ada sentuhan-sentuhan yang lebih dari sekedar kekuatan. Nah, termasuk ini ini. Nah, kemudian yang terpenting lagi adalah interior. Gimana? Suara saya cukup jelas enggak ya? Halo? Suara saya cukup jelas?
Jelas, Bu.
Oke. Jadi, hal yang menjadi dominan itu adalah mereka mulai memikirkan interior. Jadi, kenyamanan itu tidak lagi dalam sebuah cangkang, tapi ya di bagian dalam tuh nyaman begitu, dan konsep nyamannya mereka menggunakan detail-detail untuk memberikan. Jadi gini, konsep nyaman buat mereka sekarang bukan hanya fisik, tapi estetis dan keindahan juga gitu ya. Nah, ini kenapa bisa menjadi lebih matang, lebih menarik interiornya, karena mereka sudah mulai mengeksploitasi beton. Jadi kalau kalian bayangkan saat Yunani kemarin yang dieksploitasi adalah batu-batu utuh gitu ya, dan kemudian karena mereka punya kemampuan mekanika teknik, jadi penggunaan batu utuh itu menjadi menjadi struktur yang berkekuatan lebih. Nah, sekarang mereka sudah bisa mengotak-atik tuh, batu nggak cuma batu dicampur dengan abu gitu ya, kemudian dia kasih air. Nah, kemudian menjadi beton. Tapi besi belum ya, karena belum ditemukan besi. Nah, kemudian menciptakan ruang interior yang sebelumnya belum pernah ada. Jadi lebih menarik, lebih cantik. Dia menggunakan batu vulkanik asli Itali, menggunakan mereka. Nah, jadi bahan yang terpenting adalah perkembangan bahan dan teknologi bahan. Itu sebabnya sekarang kalian kalau mau pelajari kuliah, nggak cuman PA tok, nggak cuman struktur tok. Kenapa? Kalian kalau tahu bahwa berkembangnya bahan bangunan dan teknologi pada bahan-bahan itu akan sangat berperan penting. Jadi kalau mau mendesain bangunan yang bambu misalnya, yang tentu saja kalian harus pelajari adalah sifat-sifat bambu dan bagaimana teknologi merakit bambunya itu. Kenapa? Sekarang kita tahu di masa lalu kekuatan Romawi dan jauh lebih panjang daripada kekuatan Yunani kan, itu terletak pada tidak saja hanya pada teknologinya, tapi kemampuan mengolah teknologi bahan gitu ya, menciptakan bahan-bahan yang sederhana atau bahan-bahan yang ada di alam menjadi bahan baru. Dan itu sebetulnya juga bagian dari bisnis kalian. Nanti kalau kalian bisa menciptakan bangunan-bangunan dengan bahan yang ada di sekitar kita dengan teknologi yang mudah digunakan gitu ya, dan itu bisa menjadi semangat. Saya kemarin ngelihat di mana ya, sebentar lupa, di toko online kalau nggak salah atau di mana ya. Jadi benar-benar mebel-mebel yang ini bukan kebayang, mungkin kalian sudah tahu, saya aja yang telat tahunya. Saya baru tahu bahwa sofa pasti bed itu ada springnya di dalam. Dan sekarang kan dijualnya dalam bentuk kartu. Jadi kalian terima kardusnya gitu, kemudian dirakit, dan itu harganya jadi masuk akal banget. Kenapa? Karena kan pengangkutannya, shipment-nya kan jadi mudah ya, karena ringkes, kemudian kalian merakit sendiri dan sebagainya. Nah, itu sofa. Kebayang nggak sih bahwa di luar negeri itu sudah rumah. Jadi rumah itu bahannya sudah dirakit plak-plak-plak, ditempatkan, gitu kan. Dibanding kita, tantangan mereka lebih berat karena bahan bangunan yang harus mereka gunakan kan harus berkualitas karena iklimnya kan ekstrim. Dari mulai iklim minus sampai iklim panas 30 derajat kalau musim panas. Nah, sehingga bahannya harus berkualitas, tapi berkualitas nggak harus berat gitu loh. Nah, sehingga saya baru mikir, bisa nggak sih suatu saat kita melakukan itu gitu. Nah, kenapa? Karena mulai sekarang kalian sudah paham bahwa arsitek itu nggak jagoan di mendesain aja. Kalau kalian jagoan atau mempunyai passion atau menyukai kesukaan pada bidang teknologi bahan gitu ya, kemudian mempelajari bahan-bahan bangunan, kemudian pemanfaatannya itu bisa melahirkan sebuah arsitektur baru yang kita lihat di Romawi ini. Dan itu adalah tidak selalu bergantung pada materi perkuliahan karena sekarang itu semua hal itu kan terbuka, bisa dipelajari. Satu ya, kalian pelajari di internet segala macam bisa. Kedua, kurikulum kita memungkinkan itu. Jadi kalau kamu mau bikin risetnya tentang bambu, kalian bisa mendaftar di sebuah biro atau peneliti bambu atau mana, kemudian minta ke kampus untuk yang namanya kurikulum MBKM. Jadi kalian minta magang di sana, itu bisa diakui sampai 20 SKS. Jadi ambil mata kuliah di sana, mendesain bangunannya bambu di sana, PA-nya dikerjakan di sana, teknologi bangunan di sana, bahkan sampai LP3A-nya bisa di sana gitu. Ini tadi saya mencoba memaknai supaya kalian ingat bahwa perbedaan mendasar dari Yunani ke Romawi itu adalah kemampuan mereka dalam mengelola bahan bangunan dan teknologi yang digunakan untuk mengelola bangunan-bangunan itu. Ini mulai nih marmer gitu. Ini dari bahasa Inggris tak Indonesiain. Kemudian beton awal abad kedua sebelum Masehi. mortar. Ini udah ada sehingga apa namanya, ini dia bisa meniru dari yang awal yang mereka buat gitu kan, dan yang sudah dengan teknologi yang baru. Nah, dengan adanya bahan dan teknologi tentu saja bisa melahirkan bentuk-bentuk baru yang tadinya sulit dicapai, misalnya lengkung dan sebagainya. Nah, apa lagi ya? Jadi, nah ini sekarang tipe ya. Di arsitektur Romawi masih sama seperti Yunani, jadi belum ada nama seorang arsitek yang muncul. Jadi mereka bekerja di bawah perintah aja gitu. Kayaknya di Indonesia masih gitu. Maksudnya kalian yang bekerja di konsultan tuh nggak muncul, muncul nama konsultannya. Nah, tipe bangunannya, nah ini yang berbeda. Bukan berbeda ya, iya berbeda sih. Tapi berbeda itu jangan di hitam dan putih kan, tapi kalian melihat bahwa itu adalah ya perkembangan, jadi berkembang terus gitu kan, supaya ingat-ingatnya mudah. Jadi kalau Yunani itu bangunan per bangunan, gitu ya, fungsi bangunan per bangunan. Nah kalau yang Roma itu sudah keluar bangunan. Jadi ruang luar sudah didesain, kemudian apa ruang-ruang publik, kemudian ruang-ruang apa lagi digunakan oleh masyarakat umum dan sebagainya. Nah, kenapa? Karena dia sudah memasukkan unsur berkelompok. Jadi hidup itu nggak sendiri satu kelompok, kemudian nanti pindah itu enggak. Dia sudah menetap dan memiliki wilayah. Dia itu rasanya cara berpikir untuk kepentingan bersama bermasyarakat itulah salah satu hal yang membuat Roma menjadi lebih panjang. Karena apa? Karena dia sudah kekuatan bersama. Kalian tahu kan Bhinneka Tunggal Ika gitu ya. Jadi kalau kalau kekuatan bersamanya itu dikelola ya mereka menjadi lebih kuat begitu. Nah, sehingga peninggalan-peninggalan yang berwujud kota itu banyak sekali pada periode Roma. Makanya saya kalau mau jujur itu 7 tahun yang lalu waktu saya keliling Eropa itu benar-benar kota-kota di Italia ya, dari Roma itu benar-benar jauh lebih menarik. Kenapa ya? Karena mereka memang setiap mendesain itu fokus pada kota, makanya sumbu kota dan sebagainya itu dikelola dengan tepat begitu. Kota ini, nah dia sudah tahu tuh sebelum menciptakan sebuah bangunannya unik itu mereka berpikir dulu ruang terbuka gitu kan, terus dikelilingi bangunan-bangunan yang penting. Kenapa? Karena intinya adalah ruang kebersamaan itulah yang menjadi fokus kesuksesan dari mendesain bangunan-bangunan di sekelilingnya gitu loh. Nah, jadi setiap bangunan itu bisa berfungsi kalau sekelilingnya bisa berfungsi bersama-sama. Itu hakikat yang paling paling apa ya, paling berbeda di Roma, dan itu adalah perkembangan ke arah yang sangat bagus bagi kehidupan manusia setelahnya. Nah, kemudian ini contoh-contohnya. Nah, dia sudah mulai ada pasar gitu ya, sudah mulai ada pengadilan, dan ini kalau mau jujur, kota-kota di Jawa itu sudah seperti itu. Saya nggak tahu, mohon maaf yang bukan orang Jawa, apakah kalian juga punya, tapi yang setahu saya konsep kota-kota di Jawa itu sudah seperti itu. Ada alun-alun. Nah, akhirnya kita pahami bahwa sebuah masyarakat yang mampu bertahan lama itu dapat dibuktikan dari terwujudnya ruang-ruang kota yang menghubungkan antara pimpinan atau pemimpin secara politik dengan masyarakat. Kalau ruang-ruang itu terjaga, maka sistem politiknya jalan. Ini kesimpulan saya. Kenapa? Karena berdasarkan peninggalan-peninggalan pada beberapa kota kerajaan yang sekarang masih ada, itu pasti ditemukan konsep di mana ada istana, di situ ada alun-alun, tempat apa namanya, tempat rakyat menunggu sang raja. Kalau ingin memohon gitu ya kan nggak boleh langsung masuk. Nah kemudian di situ ada pasar ya di mana masyarakat bertemu, yang punya bahan dijual ya dijual, yang orang kaya butuh beli ya beli gitu ya, saling bertransaksi. Ada alun-alun, ada pasar, ada kantor pemerintahan gitu ya. Kemudian ada tempat ibadah, biasanya masjid. Saya nggak ingat kalau kota yang ada gerejanya di kota-kota Jawa, saya nggak menemukan konsepnya, tapi yang setahu saya pasti ada masjid, dan yang pemerintahan itu pasti ada ya. Kan di sana tempat tinggal raja, tapi perdana menteri dan sebagainya kan ada di gedung pemerintahannya. Dan yang terakhir nih pasti itu ada ininya kayak bangunan penjara gitu. Jadi apa namanya? Kelengkapan dari sebuah sistem pemerintahan itu ya ada tempat bertemunya masyarakat dan raja, tempat politik pemerintahan mengatur pemerintahan di mana rakyat bisa mengurus ini itu gitu ya, dan kemudian tempat ibadah, nah di mana di tempat itu semua orang merasa setara, dan yang terakhir itu ada penjara juga. Jadi untuk mencapai keseimbangan itu adalah ada hukum yang mengatur supaya semua membatasi antara hak dan kewajiban masing-masing. Nah, ini ada kalau di Eropa, nah ini sudah dibuktikan ada sejak zaman Roma udah ada pasar dan tempat-tempat penting menurut mereka. Tapi nanti kalian coba temukan sendiri tempat-tempat penting itu apa aja, dan kalian hanya membahas satu tempat penting. Nah, ini lagi perkembangan yang lain ya. Jadi coba diingat-ingat dengan imajinasi kamu. Kita kan jago tak kanan. Kalau tadi Yunani sudah menciptakan bangunan-bangunan yang maha tinggi karena dia punya konstruksi, Romawi menciptakan bukan maha tinggi tapi maha luas. Kenapa? Karena secara luas sudah menghubungkan ruang-ruang luar, sudah memiliki bangunan-bangunan publik, pasar dan sebagainya, dan untuk manusia, untuk penduduk, mereka sudah menciptakan klaster rumah. Jadi ada rumah mewah, ada rumah sedang, ada rumah sederhana. Kalau zaman Yunani, kalau rumah sederhana udah nggak dianggap gitu ya, nggak dianggap, nggak ditata, ya nggak bimu ketik-ketik yang nggak mungkin ketik yang kena angin. Pokoknya rumah-rumah sederhana masyarakat itu tidak dianggap sebagai sebuah desain arsitektur. Tapi kalau di rumah udah dikirim untuk yang miskin, yang sederhana, yang nggak mampu, itu diciptakan sebuah kayak rumah susun, terus ditata sama para arsiteknya gitu. Kemudian rumah menengah itu yang di villa-villa, kemudian rumah mewah-mewah yang istana. Jadi dua hal yang cukup menarik, kalian bisa kulik masing-masing. Ras yang bisa kulik, kalian bisa pilih gitu ya. Kemudian apalagi ya? Terus karena mereka sudah meluas. Kalau yang tadi kan vertikal ya. Yunani ini horizontal nih, semakin luas. Dengan semakin luas itu juga, mereka juga tentu saja memikirkan saluran-salurannya ya. Jadi kalau semakin luas kan berarti harus dipikirkan bagaimana air kotor gitu ya. Listrik kayaknya belum deh. Belum ada si siapa penemu listrik tuh, Edison, masalah Edison. Belum. Ya jelas air ya, karena sumber kehidupan ya. Ini terus kemudian kan gitu ya. Teater ya. Ini udah kebutuhan publik, kebutuhan orang-orang bersama itu. Nah, ini setelah masuk kepada periode republik ya, demokrasi, demokrasinya kan sudah memasukkan unsur rakyat di dalamnya. Nah, ini sudah mulai ada gedung-gedung yang juga didesain khusus. Nah, terus ini periode kekaisaran. Nah, ini periode. Nah, ini adalah pasarnya loh. Pasar. Jadi pasarnya udah kayak pasar Johar gitu kan. Ada lorong-lorong, ada apa. Sudah ditata dengan bagus. Ini adalah tahun 100 tahun ya 12 abad ke 10 dan 12 Masehi. Berapa ya 12 Masehi? Abad tahun ke-106 sampai 112 Masehi, abad ke-1. Nah, oke, sekarang kita tonton langsung videonya ya. Mana? Oh, ini langsung tak tontonin videonya. Kok bagian situ tuh?
We're in Rome on a glorious sunny December day, standing on the Capitol, looking across the Roman Forum.
I think today, for most visitors, this is a very overwhelming place. It's hard to piece together what's here. We see ancient stones, rows of ancient columns, some buildings intact, monumental triumphal arches, the Colosseum in the distance.
I think many visitors to the Forum come and in their minds try to reconstruct what this would have looked like when Rome was an empire.
When we look at fragments, we clearly understand those as ruins, but we don't realize that many have been restored, have been re-erected. We also see arches like Arch of Titus, and it's very easy to imagine that we're looking at the arch as it stood in antiquity, and the long passage of more than a millennium and a half vanishes.
So when we walk through these ruins, what we're seeing are reminders not only of antiquity, not only of the later medieval, the Renaissance, and the Baroque, but also the interventions of modern archaeology. And one of the things we want to do in this video is to identify the way that this space has been understood and used over the years.
The place we need to begin is to understand the critical importance of this site for ancient Rome itself. This is where Romulus and Remus settled, where Rome built their temple to their supreme god, Jupiter Optimus Maximus, on the Capitoline Hill. We can look over at the Palatine Hill, where the emperors built their palaces, and then this valley that was this critically important central civic space for ancient Rome for hundreds of years.
This valley was the administrative center of the city of Rome. And the city of Rome, in turn, was the center of the Roman Empire. And so there is no more important a site.
So we're talking about one of the greatest empires the world has ever known, one that stretched from England to the Levant, North Africa, embraced so many different peoples, and that grew over centuries. So starting at this small city and eventually conquering much of the Mediterranean.
If we look to our left, we can see the reconstructed Senate. This is a reminder of Rome before the empire, when Rome was a republic. Behind that are the imperial fora, where emperors created spaces to honor themselves when there was no more room to build here.
And so the Forum as a place where the civic and religious life of the ancient Romans came together. There were spaces dedicated to emperors, dedicated to their favored gods. There were places to offer sacrifices. At the far east is the ruins of an enormous structure that we know as the Basilica of Maxentius and Constantine, this important administrative. This is not a site that was built at once and then stayed the same, but that evolved over centuries as emperors wanted to identify with the space, and they built around it and continued to expand it.
And so this was under continuous renewal in the ancient world, but change didn't stop then. Slowly, over time, Rome became a Christian city. By the 4th century CE, we see a dramatic change from the pagan to the Christian. And the emperor who's most associated with that is Constantine, who, according to tradition, converted to Christianity on his deathbed.
And ultimately, by the end of the 4th century, Rome becomes officially Christian. And so buildings that were once pagan become reused as Christian spaces.
And this is important because this preserved those ancient buildings. Ancient buildings were often pillaged, were often dismantled for their high quality stone and reused unless they happened to be reused as churches. And in that case, they were preserved.
We can think of the Church of Santa Maria Antiqua. So we're looking at pagan Rome, but we're also looking at Christian Rome. There's also the Church of Saints Cosmos and Damian, which was built from pagan remains.
And it's important to remember that it was during the reign of Constantine that Rome lost its status as the capital of the empire. The capital was moved far to the east, to the city that was renamed Constantinople, which we now call Istanbul. So the Roman Empire then had two centers. It had this new administrative and political capital in the east, and it had this historical capital in the west.
But importantly, here in the West, in the early 5th century, the city of Rome was invaded and conquered. Italy itself was overrun by the people we call the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths, and ultimately caused the dissolution of this once united empire.
And after the 4th century, the Roman Empire really only continues to exist in the east.
The Christian buildings in the Roman Forum remain in use. Pilgrims come from all over to visit Rome, to visit the church that Constantine created on the other side of the Tiber River, the Church of St. Peter's.
And it was during the medieval period that Rome experiences an enormous drop in its population. What was once an enormous metropolitan center becomes largely emptied out. And in fact, the Forum gains a new nickname, the cow pasture. It is a largely abandoned space where animals now were grazing.
The idea of the Forum as overgrown with vegetation, as a place that was ideal for grazing animals, is hard to imagine for us today. And in some ways was probably very beautiful with all of this natural overgrowth over these beautiful ruins.
Well, we can get a sense of how different the Forum looked before the modern era if we look at the Prince of Piranesi. One of the first things we notice is that the ground level was much higher than it is now. Over time, debris accumulates, soil accumulates. The churches that were built on the Forum were built with their entrances 20 feet higher than the present ground level. And so what we're seeing in the modern era is the result of modern excavations.
The result of centuries of archaeology, and archaeology that at various times had different goals. So in the 18th century, the goal was different than it was, for example, in the early 20th century with Mussolini. And modern archaeologists today have different values than the archaeologists of the past. Today, we're more reluctant to dig all the way down to the classical remains. We're also concerned about the medieval era. But there was a time when all that mattered, for example, in the 18th century, in the 17th century, were those classical remains. So let's talk about that rediscovery of classical antiquity, this new interest in what was here that began in the 14th and 15th century and the beginnings of the Renaissance.
In the early 15th century, two important Florentine artists, Donatello, the sculptor, and Brunelleschi, the engineer and architect, came to Rome, and they came to study and understand antiquity.
Kalian
And
bisa
this was a
dengar suara
new
videonya nggak?
appreciation for the
Halo?
ruins of ancient Greece and Rome, not just in visual culture, but in literature and history. There's a revival, at least among some, of ancient Greek and Roman.
In the
Testing.
early 15th century, two important Florentine
Tadi kalian
artists,
bisa dengar suara videonya nggak yang pertama?
the
Bisa,
engineer,
Bu.
Oh,
came to Rome, and they came to study and to understand antiquity.
And this was a new
Videonya
appreciation
hilang, Bu.
of the culture of ancient Greece and Rome, not just in visual culture, but in literature and history. There's a revival, at least among some, of ancient Greek and Roman culture. And so
Share
Brunelleschi
screen-nya hilang, Bu.
measuring and studying and drawing. And the idea was for them to incorporate what they had learned into their own sculpture and architecture, respectively.
So, for example, we see the direct impact of classical sculpture on Donatello's art. If we look at his sculpture, David, we see a figure in bronze standing in a beautiful pose that we know as contrapposto. This is where the weight is shifted onto one leg and the entire body is responding to that. This is a kind of observation that had been developed first by the ancient Greeks and then borrowed by the ancient Romans.
And similarly, Brunelleschi is utilizing the forms of ancient Rome in his own architecture in the churches, for example, Santo Spirito in Florence. And then they're talking to Masaccio. And Masaccio in his fresco of the Holy Trinity in Santa Maria Novella is incorporating the forms of ancient Greek and Roman architecture. They're using their study of ancient ruins to renew the arts of painting, of sculpture, and architecture.
And this interest in the fragments of antiquity is part of a larger movement that we know as humanism. That is one of the defining features of the Renaissance. But when we look at the paintings of Masaccio or the sculptures of Donatello or the architecture of Brunelleschi, they're studying fragments, but their interest is not in the fragment itself. And so it's interesting to look ahead a generation at the painting of somebody like Mantegna, who's interested in the fragment.
Mantegna clearly shows us his love for the ancient Roman ruin itself. Mantegna is creating paintings of Christian saints, of the Madonna and Child for a Christian audience. But of course, Christianity grew up in ancient Rome. So Mantegna uses those ruins to suggest how Christianity is superior to ancient pagan religions.
And a wonderful example of that is the small painting Saint Sebastian, where we see the martyred Christian saint filled with arrows, but he remains miraculously alive, looking
Bu Santi, videonya hilang, Bu.
of an ancient Roman arch, suggesting that Christian spiritual faith is stronger even than the great Roman Empire, that Christianity outlasted Rome. And so the fragment takes on symbolic value.
This Renaissance interest in the culture of ancient Greece and Rome reaches the highest levels of the church. Various popes are funding excavations around the city of Rome to discover the ruins of classical civilization. And in a way, the city becomes a place where treasure can be found nearly everywhere. So that if someone is building a villa, they're discovering fragments of ancient Roman sculptures, they're discovering portions of buildings, and we begin to get this interest in reconstructing. How can we take the fragments that we've discovered buried deep within the ground and put them back together? And were they putting them back together the way they were supposed to be put back together? And what pieces were missing? And what should be done about the pieces that were missing? Should artists create a foot or an arm to help to reconstruct an ancient Greek or Roman sculpture? Michelangelo was present for the excavation, the uncovering of the great sculpture of the Laocoon. We know that fragments like the Belvedere torso, these things now in the Vatican museums, were enormously influential on Michelangelo, on Raphael, on Leonardo. In fact, Leonardo advised artists to include ruins in their paintings.
And he does that in his great unfinished painting, The Adoration of the Magi. If you look at the upper left, you see a wonderful set of stairs that rise up to a broken arch and to a ruined column.
So many of the ancient sculptures that we study today have names that are derived from the gorgeous villas of wealthy families of Rome.
In the 17th and 18th century, a new phenomena arises, something that
Referennya hilang mulai kapan? Hah? Halo?
Dari awal
Mulai
videonya, Bu.
Oh,
dari awal Bu
astagfirullah.
waktu multi tes.
Jangan sama ketua Lemnet ngirim
In the
paper.
early 15th century, two important Florentine artists, Donatello, the sculptor, and Brunelleschi, the engineer and architect, came to Rome, and they came to study and to understand antiquity.
And this was a new appreciation for the ruins, for the culture of ancient Greece and Rome, not just in visual culture, but in literature and history. There was a revival, at least among some, of ancient Greek and Roman culture. And so Brunelleschi and Donatello are looking and measuring and studying and drawing. And the idea was for them to incorporate what they had learned into their own sculpture and architecture, respectively.
So, for example, we see the direct impact of classical sculpture on Donatello's art. If we look at his sculpture, David, we see a figure in bronze standing in a beautiful pose that we know as contrapposto. This is where the weight is shifted onto one leg and the entire body is responding to that. This is a kind of observation that had been developed first by the ancient Greeks and then borrowed by the ancient Romans.
And similarly, Brunelleschi is utilizing the forms of ancient Rome in his own architecture in the churches, for example, Santo Spirito in Florence. And then they're talking to Masaccio. And Masaccio in his fresco of the Holy Trinity in Santa Maria Novella is incorporating the forms of ancient Greek and Roman architecture. They're using their study of ancient ruins to renew the arts of painting, of sculpture, and architecture.
And this interest in the fragments of antiquity is part of a larger movement that we know as humanism, that is one of the defining features of the Renaissance. But when we look at the paintings of Masaccio or the sculptures of Donatello or the architecture of Brunelleschi, they're studying fragments, but their interest is not in the fragment itself. And so it's interesting to look ahead a generation at the painting of somebody like Mantegna, who's interested in the fragment.
Mantegna clearly shows us his love for the ancient Roman ruin itself. Mantegna is creating paintings of Christian saints, of the Madonna and Child, for a Christian audience. But of course, Christianity grew up in ancient Rome. So Mantegna uses those ruins to suggest how Christianity is superior to ancient pagan religions.
And a wonderful example of that is the small painting Saint Sebastian, where we see the martyred Christian saint filled with arrows, but he remains miraculously alive, looking up to God, tied to the fragments of an ancient Roman arch, suggesting that Christian spiritual faith is stronger even than the great Roman Empire, that Christianity outlasted Rome. And so the fragment takes on symbolic value.
This Renaissance interest in the culture of ancient Greece and Rome reaches the highest levels of the church. Various popes are funding excavations around the city of Rome to discover the ruins of classical civilization. And in a way, the city becomes a place where treasure can be found nearly everywhere, so that if someone is building a villa, they're discovering fragments of ancient Roman sculptures, they're discovering portions of buildings, and we begin to get this interest in reconstructing. How can we take the fragments that we've discovered buried deep within the ground and put them back together? And were they putting them back together the way they were supposed to be put back together? And what pieces were missing? And what should be done about the pieces that were missing? Should artists create a foot or an arm to help to reconstruct an ancient Greek or Roman sculpture? Michelangelo was present for the excavation, the uncovering of the great sculpture of the Laocoon. We know that fragments like the Belvedere torso, these things now in the Vatican museums, were enormously influential on Michelangelo, on Raphael, on Leonardo. In fact, Leonardo advised artists to include ruins in their paintings.
And he does that in his great unfinished painting, The Adoration of the Magi. If you look at the upper left, you see a wonderful set of stairs that rise up to a broken arch and to a ruined column.
So many of the ancient sculptures that we study today have names that are derived from the gorgeous villas of wealthy families of Rome.
In the 17th and 18th century, a new phenomena arises, something we call the Grand Tour, where young men, as part of their education, men from wealthy families, would travel throughout Europe to important ancient sites, and Rome was an absolutely required stop.
In fact, there are, just like today, souvenirs that could be purchased by those on the Grand Tour and taken back to their houses in France or England or wherever to show that they've done the Grand Tour and were learned and well-traveled. And so we begin to have this increasing interest and isolation of the ruin itself. Now, we should say that interest in ruins is not unique to this period of the Renaissance and after. It's something that we see in many cultures throughout history, but it gains particular traction and popularity in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries.
While there are plenty of representations of ruins and of antiquity in the Renaissance, interest in ruins, interest in antiquity, is accelerated exponentially because of the discovery in the 18th century of the ancient city of Pompeii, a city that had been covered by ash, that had been extinguished, but also preserved.
And for the first time, Europeans had a sense of the daily life of an ancient Roman city. But this is also the time of the beginnings of art history. With all of the discoveries that were being made of classical fragments, there were those like Winkelmann who attempted to date them, to correlate what was being found with ancient Greek and Roman literary sources. Art history, in a way, was born.
This was a period, the Enlightenment, when philosophers and political thinkers began to question absolute faith in God and the monarchies of Europe, thinking instead logic and the rational might be more important. And in the context of the forum, we could use scientific analysis to understand the way that history had unfolded.
There was the beginning of the understanding of layers of history, of stratigraphy, of digging down in order to dig through time.
The law of superposition, that is, when something is layered over something else, it's newer than the thing below it. These ideas are being expressed in the work of artists who begin to include a kind of melancholy in their representations of ruins, a melancholy that speaks to the grandeur of time, that acknowledges the transience of human accomplishment.
And the ruin is beautiful and a reminder of the transience of human life. But it also, for artists like Fuseli, became a symbol of a past era that couldn't be surpassed. How could those in the late 18th and early 19th century possibly equal the incredible grandeur of Rome?
Those kinds of thoughts are very much the product of a moment when England and France and other increasingly industrializing countries are gaining more and more mastery over the environment, are building enormous cities, and are beginning to ask themselves, will our cities also become ruins?
We also see artists like Hubert Robert who painted an image of the Louvre in ruins. So he's imagining a future when this important palace, this expression of the monarchy, of Napoleon's empire, is one day in the future itself a ruin. We also see an image where the Bank of England is represented as a ruin. And we know also that artists are intentionally fabricating ruins.
The late 18th and early 19th century used the ruin as a vehicle to come to terms with modernity. Science had really come to the fore. Traditional religion was receding. and artists and poets, people that we associate with the movement of Romanticism. We're looking for the awe, the grandeur, the power that we once associated with God, but that was more difficult to locate in the modern world. The fragment reminded us of the futility of empire. It reminded us of the awesomeness of time, something that man could never triumph over.
And we see this expressed in paintings by Caspar David Friedrich, where instead of classical ruins, we see the ruins of a Gothic church. There's also a sense that not only has time eroded human achievement and human glory, but also that human beings themselves are responsible, that we've let things decline. We've allowed civilizations and their traces to vanish before our eyes.
And so we have a responsibility. And it's at this moment that modern archaeology develops. That is an effort to understand the past through physical remains, through excavations, using scientific methods.
Just as there was an awareness of history, of the way that empires rise and fall, there was also a sense that you could build monumental architecture so that when it became a ruin, it still spoke of your culture's grandeur. And perhaps the most disturbing example of that is the theory of ruins put forward by Albert Speer, Hitler's favorite architect.
This is the height of hubris, that the Nazis would outlive even their projected 1,000-year Reich, and that their constructions would equal the Romans, not only when they were intact, but even projected far into the future.
They wanted to rival ancient Rome. Ancient Rome had left majestic ruins that spoke to the greatest achievements of humankind.
And one of the allies of the Nazis, Mussolini, had at his disposal the actual ruins of Rome and undertook enormous excavation projects, demolishing the medieval, demolishing the Baroque, in order to highlight the great ancient traditions of the city.
He had Hitler come and visit, and Mussolini put on a show highlighting ancient Rome's grandeur.
Some would argue that modern archaeology, and not just the archaeology of Mussolini, did damage, that archaeology in search of knowledge has served also to destroy the beauty of the accumulation of time.
They're no longer overgrown. They're no longer so topsy-turvy. There are no cows grazing here. You have to pay to enter.
The Forum has always been a place of pilgrimage and is now a place of modern mass tourism. And with vendors just outside the historical park selling souvenirs, the experience might seem to be trivialized. But for me, and I think for many visitors, even when it's crowded, it is still possible to experience the grandeur of time, the sense of the sublime that was so important to artists in the late 18th and early 19th century. Those things are still true. And so when we walk through the Forum, when we look at its monuments, when we look at its fragments, at these ruins, what we're seeing is not simply a fragment of ancient Rome. What we're seeing is a testament to the changing meanings of the ruin through time.
Ini ada video berikutnya juga, maka kita pegang nggak ya waktunya? Oh, masih. Kita ini aja ya, hosting dulu. Kalau ini kayaknya 3 menit. Ini hosting dulu 9 menit. Masih. Okay. Baru setelah itu kita coba kita simak engineering-nya.
Housing in ancient Rome brings to mind initially the villa, a large countryside residence. However, many Roman citizens lived in so-called insulae, urban apartment blocks which had up to 7 floors. Only the wealthiest Romans were able to afford a domus, a city mansion, and only the super rich owned a countryside villa. The home of an average citizen in the city of Rome could have looked like this. These blocks of houses the Romans called islands, or insulae in Latin. On the ground floor, there were stores, the so-called tabernae. On the upper floors, there were cenacula, apartments. The roomiest and best furnished flats were on the first floor. They had multiple rooms, balconies, toilets, and in some cases even running water fed by aqueducts. The residents of the higher floors lived in smaller and poorer apartments, without private toilets, but they were cheaper. On the rooftops of insulae, there were sometimes even improvised wooden sheds. Due to poor building, bad structures and very little space in between the insulae, they had lots of issues. Fires could destroy entire districts. Water could get into the cheaply air-dried brick of the walls during a flooding. This made the insulae, which were fragile to begin with, even more unstable and could even let them collapse. The apartments themselves were often in similar bad shape. Wind and rain came through the walls, which were full of cracks. Despite these obvious disadvantages, the major part of the urban citizens lived in such insulae. The main reason for this is that the rooms in insulae were rental accommodations. The insulae were originally introduced to handle the enormous and growing population of the city in relatively small and confined spaces. The historian Hannah Platz states that there were 40,000 insulae. In contrast, she estimates that there were fewer than 2,000 domus. These differ from insulae, according to Janet Delane, in that they were privately owned properties. Hence, they were not affordable for most people. But whoever was capable of affording something better than rooms in an insulae would for sure upgrade to a domus. Places of residence were relevant to social status and the self-representation of anyone participating in politics. Appropriate dwellings were simply must-haves when climbing the social and political ladder. Let's have a look at an example from the 1st century BC. Quintus Lucretius Ofella was a well-known general of equestrian rank. In the Roman civil wars, he served under the dictator Lucius Cornelius Sulla and led his men at the siege of Praeneste. He seized the city and presented to Sulla the head of Marius, Sulla's antagonist. Because Ofella played a vital role in Sulla's victory, he gained a lot of money and a massive boost in prestige. Except for his success in battle and his death, we know very little about Ofella. But importantly, Plutarch informs us that he sought to move up in society and pursue a political career. Usually, a political career would have been only an option for Romans of higher birth, i.e. aristocrats with a senatorial ancestry. Although it was possible to advance in Rome without this, it was significantly harder. Those who still managed to do so were called homines novi, new men. The most famous example of a homo novus is Cicero. For Ofella to pursue politics, he would have needed to improve his social standing by quite a margin. Before Sulla's reforms, it would have been unlikely for Ofella to even get a chance. Like many men of equestrian rank, Ofella might have lived in a first-floor apartment of an insula. He would thus have needed a private residence, a domus of his own, to be on par with other aristocrats. But to buy or build a domus was no small enterprise. The domus, the house of the Roman elite, was constructed using costly materials such as marble. They were furnished with elaborate decorations, inlaid panels, intricate door jambs and sturdy columns. Both the walls and the floor were embellished with pompous paintings, fabulous frescoes and intricate mosaics. In the outside wall of the domus, facing the streets, were tabernae as well. On entering the domus, through the ostium, the entrance, one first stepped into the vestibulum, the entrance hall, sometimes also called fauces, which means something like open mouth or throat. Through this one passed to the atrium, the center of the domus. The atrium was a large central hall with a statue or an altar to the household gods. It was surrounded by high-ceiling porticos. In the very center, there was an open square in the roof, the so-called compluvium, through which the rain fell into the impluvium, a basin on the ground. The atrium was the most important part of the domus, because it was the place where the guests and petitioners were greeted. Leading off the atrium was a dining room, the triclinium, a study room, the tablinium, bedrooms, the cubicula and the culina, the culinary kitchen where the slaves prepared meals. The tablinium connected the atrium to the peristylium, a small, roofless courtyard, around which the back part of the house was centered. From this part of the domus, one could enter the bathrooms and the kitchen. Somewhere in this part of the house, there was usually a posticum, an entrance for servants and family members who wanted to leave the house unseen. As a whole, the building was constructed on one axis, so that an entering guest could see through the vestibulum, the atrium and the tablinum to the peristylium. The domus was closed towards the streets, and the walls didn't bear any windows. This created a safe space, separating the living space from the outside, which was regarded as dangerous. Since the 1st century BC, the word domus does not only refer to a building but also to a whole household, including family members, servants and slaves. Now, about the time Offella's domus would have been built, he heard that Sulla was looking for new candidates to fill the depleted senatorial benches. Because Ofella hadn't been contacted personally, he decided to run his own campaign for consulship. He even canvassed on the Forum Romanum, despite Sulla had told him not to. Eventually, he figured that he had to improve his architectural self-representation even further and to make his wealth a little more obvious to the public. So he looked for a nice spot on a hill outside the city, say near Tusculum, where he could have built a villa suburbana, a countryside residence. Besides the villa suburbana, there were several other types of villae. There was, for example, the villa rustica, which was basically an estate with functioning agricultural facilities and workshops. This agricultural flair was much less important in other types of villas, but it was a common feature even for primarily representative villas. Ofella would have wanted a place to spend his leisure time, otium, in which he would have perhaps engaged in literary or philosophical pursuits. What sets the villa apart from the domus and the insulae is not only their sheer size, but their placement in nature. Around the Gulf of Naples, in southern Italy, for example, the villae were placed in the mountains, around lakes or close to the sea. A villa was deemed perfect if it dominated the scenery and provided a vast panorama view. In addition, extensive lavish gardens surrounded the houses, and redirected streams gently flowed through the gardens. Ironically, while the poor tenants of urban insulae with cracked walls unwillingly suffered chilly winds, the houses of rich people were placed in windy locations on purpose to ensure fresh air circulation and to reduce bad smells. Indispensable to a villa were cryptae, multiple other porticos and a bath. Of course, the furniture and ornamentation depended on the budget of the owner. The range went from modest interiors, focused on an elitist educational landscape, to all the splendor one could think of. Vast mosaics, art collections, mural paintings, extensive libraries or expensive dishes. The villae are also famous for another very important feature, only affordable for the rich: heating. The Romans used so-called hypocausts. The word is derived from the Greek terms hypo, meaning under, and caust, meaning burnt. As shown here, the system of central heating provided warmth by heating the space beneath the ground through the smoke and heat of the furnace. Many rich Romans possessed more than one villa, spent a major part of the year there, and went to their domus in the city only to pursue their political activities. It was a villa in this style Ofella might have wanted to build. It would have certainly impressed his fellow Romans, but why did it not work out for him? Well, we know from Plutarch that Ofella, while gathering supporters for his election, went to the Forum with a large crowd of followers. Sulla's patience with Ofella and his self-made political advances was wearing thin, very thin. He sent one of his centurions over to Ofella. In front of all the Romans on the Forum, he simply had him slain.
The Romans invented concrete over 2,000 years ago and built roads that are still around today. They used arches and domes to create monumental buildings with big airy interiors that looked truly Olympian, also still around. And they moved thousands of tons of water using aqueducts to keep a bustling population unthirsty. These old buildings, all still around. But did Romans come up with ideas about physics, like why arches support weight differently than right-angled structures? Did they ask proto-chemistry questions, like what is stuff? Like what is the tiny things that make up good concrete? Nope. Let's look at what knowledge the Romans made in order to set up a debate that, spoiler alert, is still going on. Do you understand something when you can explain why it's true in the abstract? Or do you understand something when you can do things with it, even if you can't explain why? The Romans inherited much of their knowledge from the Greeks. From 323 to 31 BCE, the geometry, physics, astronomy, and other disciplines developed by the pre-Socratics, Plato, and Aristotle spread throughout the Hellenistic world. This world combined parts of Asia, Africa, and Europe, influenced by Greek thought due in large part to Alexander's brief supervillain rampage. In Alexandria, Egypt, the biggest of the 70 cities that Alexander named after himself, the kings paid for the museum, or House of Muses. This wasn't a museum in the modern sense of the word, but more like a research university. In Pergamon, in what's now Turkey, the kings paid for the library, which was, wait for it, a really big collection of books. These institutions lasted for centuries, drawing visitors from far and wide. Alas, over the same period of time that these Greeks were supporting research, a tribe from central Italy called the Romans went on a new supervillain rampage that also lasted for centuries. The Romans would continue to spread classical Greek thought. We even call their culture Greco-Roman. But natural philosophy during Greco-Roman times didn't advance much. Today, we remember the Romans for their engineering, or ability to improve some real-world system, not their deep thoughts about why the world is the way it is. Roman engineering built on Greek engineering, and making knowledge is political, and most politicians really want the same things. Bigger catapults and lots of ships. So Greco-Roman leaders did what heads of state everywhere have always done. They paid smart people to make bigger weapons. In the ancient Mediterranean, the job of building war machines was called architecton, or architect. Most of these architects were anonymous, did not write down their theories, but a few of them did. The most famous architecton, Archimedes of Syracuse, fought for the Greeks against the Romans. Archimedes is famous today as a mathematician. He worked out many geometrical proofs, including the area of a circle, and pioneered infinitesimals and exponents. Archimedes also invented a lot of useful contraptions, including the water screw and compound pulley. The water screw pumps water by turning a screw inside of a pipe. This was immediately useful in irrigation, and a mechanical way to move water uphill, just plain cool. Archimedes also designed various war machines to kill the Romans who were trying to take over his hometown. He was so impressive that the Roman general ordered his troops to capture, not kill him. But one soldier, particularly low on chill, got frustrated when Archimedes wouldn't stop working on a mathematical proof. In a sense, Archimedes kept it so real that he got himself, and symbolically an era of Greek science, killed. Archimedes was interested in some of the natural philosophy that explained his machines, but for most other thinkers of his time, astronomy, physics, and math were important for abstract, quasi-religious reasons. Making weapons was a matter of political power. The heavens from which rain fell were perfect and abstract. Shipbuilding was an art, something that was learned from practice. It was not a matter of understanding hydrodynamics or the chemical properties of wood that made it bendy and floaty. Aristotle came up with a handy division between these types of knowledge that we still use today. He classified knowledge as either useful or theoretical. Useful knowledge was called techne, which is where we get technology. Technology has until recently, in historical terms, been connected to the idea of art, meaning something you can learn by doing and can see in the real world. Theoretical knowledge, on the other hand, was episteme, the root of our word epistemology, the study of knowledge. Episteme is the sort of knowledge that we most associate with science. Science is abstract, represented by formulas. When historians of science talk about the possibilities of what we can know, they use the word epistemic. One of the most influential thinkers working on epistemic questions during the Greco-Roman period was Claudius Ptolemy, a Greek or Greek-speaking southern Egyptian living in Roman-held Alexandria. In addition to optics and the science of music, Ptolemy took up Plato's old problem of how to fit the observed data about how the planets all moved to the theory of a cosmos made up of perfect circles with Earth at its center. He got really into this, mixing together three kinds of solutions in order to make the math work. Epicycles, for example, were the tiny circles that the planets moved along around bigger circles. Ptolemy's version of the cosmos, a mathematically neater version of Aristotle's and Plato's, became the basis of the understanding of the universe across much of the medieval Christian and Islamic world. His great astronomical work, the Mathematical Syntaxis, was named by Arabic scholars as the Almagest, or the greatest. Fun fact, the Almagest may have been edited by one of the first recorded female natural philosophers, Hypatia of Alexandria. So we're on episode 6 of History of Science, and yes, this is the first mention of a woman. Ptolemy was also pretty much the authority on earthly geography in the Greco-Roman world. His book on the subject, called Geography, discusses the data he uses and why. It provided a source for other scholars to use in more accurately picturing and drawing the world for centuries. Oh, and none of these thinkers thought that the Earth was flat. Flat Earth theory may have more proponents today than it did in Greco-Roman times. As Ptolemy shows, epistemic work was important to a few Greco-Roman.
Bangunan ya. Kita masih punya 13 menit. Ntar masih ada lagi materi nggak yang sudah pernah saya housing udah. Oke, kalau ada yang mau didiskusikan silahkan didiskusikan yang lebih. Kalau yang tadi saya loncati soalnya di teknologi secara umum. Nah, ada yang mau ditanyakan? Kalau nggak ada yang, kalau kalian tidak ada yang ditanyakan, besok kan ya perkuliahannya, mau nggak mau berarti kalian menyiapkan presentasi sekarang 3 menit maksimal untuk memilih salah satu kasus, kemudian diposting di reply di situ untuk kita bahas besok, dan kemudian jangan lupa nanti jam 7 kalian ya, jam 1 di sini tambah ya jam 7 kalian. Kita ikut acaranya Bina Live. Bagus banget anunya, running acaranya, bisa buat pengalaman kalian nanti kalau bikin acara sendiri gitu ya. Potong-potongannya, editannya, pembuka dan penutupnya yang dirakit-rakit itu bagus sekali. Jadi kalau nggak ada pertanyaan, kuliahnya saya akhiri. Mudah-mudahan suara saya kedengeran. Karena yang lain pada diam. Halo? Oke. Sudah pada daftar ya yang nanti sore ya? Udah ya. Itu benar-benar mumpung pembicaranya saya. Jadi kalau kalian nggak jelas materinya, kalian bisa tanya besok-besok lagi. Dan itu adalah buku saya yang kemarin saya bagi kepada kalian yang akan saya presentasikan. Jadi kalian separuh dengerin aja udah paham lah ya, karena bukunya bahasa Indonesia, dapat sertifikatnya, dan tentu saja kalian belajar bagaimana menyiapkan sebuah acara dengan running yang menarik. Oke, saya akhiri perkuliahannya. Jangan lupa absen. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.